So my talk today is about my experiences having led Ghost through the transition towards using Ember instead of what it used previously, and what that's like, sort of doing that in an open source project. And as mentioned several times already, the project I'm talking about is Ghost. But just so I've got an idea of who I'm talking to, before Yehuda mentioned it this morning, if you'd heard of it, can you put your hands up? Oh my god, okay, that's really, really cool. Great. It's always, you never quite know, like I do it at a Node conference and it's like, maybe, but at an Ember conference, that's awesome, great. So I just want to quickly fly through some bullet points of the kind of things you need to know about Ghost just to make sure the rest of the talk makes sense. So let's start at the beginning. It's a blogging platform. Most people have got that already. The focus of it is on building a beautiful, minimal UI to deliver, a fantastic writing experience. It's all about, facilitating long-form writing. It is built in Node, and it does now have a shiny Ember app as well. And that makes it a full-stack JavaScript application. It's nothing else other than JavaScript in Ghost. It's not just an open source project, but it is also a non-profit. It is backed by a foundation, and that foundation also has a sustainable business model. So what the foundation does, as well as driving the development of the product, we also run a hosting platform. You can pay us to host your blog for you, and because we're a non-profit in the way we're set up, every penny that we take has to be spent on developing software, so paying developers to work on it full time. So that's how the whole project works. That's Ghost. It's a design-focused, open source, non-profit, sustainable blogging platform. It's built completely in JavaScript. And my role, I'm a co-founder, I'm the CTO, and I run the sort of open source side of the project, among other things. So when I'm talking about Ghost and Ember, I'm talking about the part of Ghost where you can log in and you can manage your content, you can write a new blog post, add users, tags, all of that kind of stuff. So it's the admin part of Ghost. And I have a habit of referring to it by many names, the admin panel, the admin UI, the Ember client, but that's what I'm talking about. And under the hood, Ghost has quite a deliberate structure. So at the top there, you can see there's a JSON API, and that handles the storing and retrieving of all data. And then underneath that, there's two almost entirely separate applications. The first one being the blog server, the part that renders HTML pages for your blog. And so that's done on the server side with a focus on making it easy to cache those pages so that we can deliver like a near static experience, but with all the fun of dynamic applications. And then you've got the admin client, the part that's written in Ember, where you manage everything. So that's the picture as it stands today. But that's not how it's always been. There was a time before Ember, and that's what I want to talk about today. So before Ember, Ghost was a small and very messy backbone application. And in about January last year, we realized we'd hit an absolute roadblock with the solution that we had at the time. The code that we had was small, messy, and really, really, really fragile. It was just a case that we felt like if we added one more thing to this application, it was just going to collapse under its own weight, much like you heard Steve Jobs talking about earlier. Thanks for setting me up, Yehuda. So anyway, we just started living in fear that it was all going to come crashing down on us, and we had this realization, we need a new tool. Because we can't build what we want to build with the ones we've got. So we need a new tool, or new tools, and we need new tools that would allow us to build ambitious user interfaces, ambitious components, rather than sort of keeping it as minimal and pared back as it had been. We had these ideas of things that we wanted to build. And we also wanted to be able to move faster and break less things. Because at the time, we were moving very slowly, and every time we touched something, something fell apart. But we are an open source project, so in order to decide on what tools we want to use, the first thing we needed to do was have a discussion and to collect as much input and feedback from the community as we possibly could. Now, this for me was an incredibly daunting task because I didn't really feel that having a conversation about which JavaScript framework to use was going to be productive. I had a horrible feeling that we might have a bit of a flame war. And it was also the first time we'd made a major decision sort of in that open arena, like certainly a technical decision. Up till then, you know, a lot of things had happened behind the scenes, and this was going to be our first go at doing true open source. And so I spent quite a lot of time thinking about how I should go about doing it. And what happened, I realized I really genuinely didn't know the answer. I didn't know what tool to use. I didn't know what would work best. But I did know what the problems were. So I wrote them down in an issue. I just started talking about what the issues were and asking people for their experiences. So just to quickly run through what those major problems that we were having were. The first was we weren't even sure if we were supposed to be building a single page app. There was a lot of confusion. The backbone stuff sort of took over sometimes, and then sometimes we were doing stuff on the server side. It was all a mess and it wasn't clear. And because of that, we had really ugly routing. Had some on the client side, some on the server side. We also had problem with backbones routing and history and back buttons, and it was a nightmare. There was absolutely no tools for data binding anywhere in the application. We were doing everything manually. That was really painful. It was really fragile. It was horrible. We were also having tons of issues with views, particularly views not getting unbound and therefore causing memory issues. Subviews were a pain, nightmare. And all of that led to poor mobile support. And finally, fundamentally, we were just lacking direction on how we were supposed to solve problems. Where was the structure? How, where would you put a piece of code? What were the ideas behind it? And it was just completely lost, really. And anyway, so I wrote it all down, this issue, and it actually worked out great. It was a great issue. We had over 100 comments. Some of them were 500 words long. There are people in this room that I know commented. There are lots of names that you would recognize on there. And if you're in a similar position to me at all, if you're thinking about using Ember and that's why you're here, go and read this issue because it's a goldmine. But from our perspective, the discussion sort of evolved through those comments. And we realized that we were sort of playing off Angular versus Ember, and that both of those things were going to solve all of the technical challenges that we had. So it came down to just one of the problems that we had. We were lacking direction. We needed to have something that came and told us, lots of things about how to do things. What we didn't want to do was write our own framework from primitives. We didn't want to be having to write documentation on how that worked. We didn't want to be making lots of decisions. We just wanted to build Ghost. We didn't want to do all this stuff. So what we wanted was something that gave us a rulebook. We wanted an off-the-shelf solution. And that, you can't pick, Ember versus Angular in that case. Ember wins hands down. So that's what happened. We chose Ember. And so for us, the thing that a lot of people say is the downside to Ember, that it's so opinionated and prescriptive and heavy duty, was the benefit. It was the clear win for us. And there was one other clear reason for us for picking Ember, and that was that during that discussion, we totally fell in love with the Ember community. We had all these people come and comment on our issue and talk to us and help us and build demos. They were all super friendly, super helpful, and they were just lovely people. So that's just another good reason. They gave us the confidence to pick Ember. And so we, in true open source style, we had a discussion about it. We made a final decision. We wrote an announcement, and then we were stuck with the task of actually, starting the work. So what ended up happening was that the migration process was just a perfect example of open source development in action. But that wasn't what we expected to happen. The idea was that we would sort of start by taking the existing end-to-end testing suite that we had in place, expand out those tests to cover more of the cases, and then when we were comfortable, we had good test coverage. We wanted to rally together as many people as we could from the Ghost team, from Ember contributors, Ember Community, and from our own contributors, get as many people together as we could and just sort of rattle through it like tearing off a plaster. It was only reasonably small at that time. But then we realized that we needed to fix our API. Because although we had one, it wasn't clean, it wasn't consistent, it wasn't clear, it wasn't complete. And there were lots of places where that we knew that was going to cause us problems with Ember. So I showed you this diagram which shows you how Ghost is structured. That's how Ghost is structured now. That's not what it was like back then. It was more like this. So there are all these places where we were cheekily sort of dropping out of the single page application and using server-side to just do the flows that were hard to do with the API, like resetting passwords and authentication and stuff. We hadn't figured those out yet. So we needed to fix that. And because the people who worked in the Ghost team were already comfortable and familiar with the API, and we didn't know anything about Ember, we sort of disappeared off and squirreled away on the API for a while. And whilst we did that, people from the Ember community and from our contribution community as well sort of banded together on a branch and started building our Ember admin without us really being involved in it. It was great. All I did was test the pull requests, see that they did basically the same thing the old one did, and merge them. Brilliant, job done. But that meant that what I was expecting to happen was that I would learn Ember and become an Ember developer. Nope, don't know anything. Don't know why I'm here. No, but I really didn't get to touch it as much. I can fix a bug, I can figure out where things are going wrong, but I'm certainly not the person that's going to be implementing a component anytime soon. And another thing that happened during this process was that we kind of got cold feet. Not about Ember, but we suddenly realized it had been a couple of months and we needed to ship something to our users. And if we shipped something that had no tangible improvement for them, they weren't going to be very forgiving about it. We're so young, we've got so many features left to implement. So we decided that rather than wholesale switching the whole admin panel, like as it was, we would add multi-user, we'd add the team page. And before that, you could only have one user on your Ghost blog, one author. And so when we shipped the Ember admin panel, we shipped it with all the features you need for managing a team of people, which is great. So we shipped our first version of Ghost that had an Ember admin panel sort of about 6 months after we originally made that choice to use Ember. So it was a bit longer, it took a bit longer than we expected. And that sounds pretty negative. But there was not just the outcome of having a new shiny Ember app to play with, but there were other side effects of doing that project, big positive wins that we made during those 6 months. So we cleaned up the API, and that was really good, because now we've got something that we can start thinking about sharing with people so they can do different things with their Ghost blog. We got multi-user, as I showed you earlier. And also, one thing that happened that I was kind of hoping would happen was by working with the Ember team and the Ember community, I was really hoping that some of their processes and their practices around open source would rub off on us. Because as Jamie says, that our project's really well run, but we see Ember as being the ideal open source project. We see it as being a model. And so getting to work so closely with so many people, we were really hoping we would learn something. And what happened during those 6 months is that we had these contributors come in and start doing so much work for us. We felt we wanted to reward them and value them more. And so we sort of adopted Ember's idea of having a core team and started letting people outside of the Ghost Foundation to having commit rights, which is a completely new thing for us, a massive boon. And so that was a great win for us. The one thing I would say, though, was that the issues that we had with our API, or needing to improve and clean up our API, probably the one cautionary tale I have in this talk about moving to Ember. You really do have to be ready with your API to back onto the application. You can't not do that. So if you are thinking about building an Ember application, you do need to think really carefully about the data that goes behind it. And that sort of draws into what Yehuda was saying about what sort of applications do and don't fit for Ember. So it has been now over a year since we finished that project, which means that we have been an Ember project for longer than we were ever a Backbone project. And we're in quite an interesting place in terms of being able to look back over that whole process of making a decision and implementing Ember, and then the time we've had since to deal with the challenges it's presented us with, and really assess the impact that Ember has had on our project. So the first question that comes to my mind when I start looking back and thinking about assessing what we did is, did we make the right choice? And the answer to that is, yeah, we did. If we... I love it when you get a random impromptu round of applause. It's awesome. So, no, if we were going to do this whole thing again today, we would make the same choice. There's nothing else out there that would put us in the same position that Ember has put us in. And I'd say that, not only did we solve all those technical challenges that I mentioned earlier, they just sort of just melted away into oblivion when we took Ember on. You don't think about those things anymore. But we're operating on a completely different level in terms of the problems that we can tackle, the hard problems, the complex interfaces that we can implement. We can build things that we could never have built before, and that's awesome. So we can build those ambitious interfaces, we can move faster, and we can break less things. And actually, if you look back at Ghost's release history, you'll see that before we shipped the Ember application, things were kind of slow and clunky, and we didn't make many changes to the interface. And then in the months afterwards, every month without fail, we landed something big and heavy and new. And those were all the things that were backed up. Just we knew we wanted to build them. We knew what they needed to look like and how they needed to work. We just couldn't build them, and we just sort of rattled through them. It was great. It was so productive. But then that's all very positive and all very good. So let's ask a slightly more revealing question. Did Ember allow us to reach our goals? Are we where we expected to be? How are we achieving what we want to be achieving? And the answer to that one is a tentative, not quite yet. And to explain my thinking on this, I want to go and talk about complexity. And I feel like Yehuda and Steve Jobs have kind of done a bit of this for me today already. But let's talk just for a second about complexity. I've heard Yehuda and Tom talking about things, the ideas behind Ember, what they intended to achieve. And this idea of complexity was one of the things that interested me most. There was a particular idea that there is a tendency in large-scale client-side JavaScript applications to build overly complex applications purely because of, or mostly because of, the use of global scope. That is that if everything in your application, every model, every view, every whatever, can talk to every other thing, every other object, then there's a tendency to rely on that and accidentally build tightly coupled systems. And if you build tightly coupled systems, then as you start adding new things, the network effect kicks in. So when you go to add a new thing, you're also adding lots and lots of connections, and your application is getting more and more complex. And so this is my very hand-wavy diagram that tries to visualize what that looks like. So you start off building a JavaScript application, and everything's going reasonably well. The complexity's not growing too much. It's all going fine. And then suddenly, at a certain point, you just hit like a point of no return where it's just so hard to add one more thing. And that's the point we got to with our backbone application, right? We got to this point where it was just too hard to add any more things to our application. And so there are ideas in Ember where they want to prevent this from happening. So you set up this framework, you get this whole environment where every time you add a new object to your application, a new Ember object, that is isolated. It doesn't have access to every other thing. And if you want access to other things, you have to explicitly make that happen. And that tends you towards building loosely coupled applications and helps to reduce complexity. That's just one of the things that can or may not happen in a JavaScript application. I'm not saying that if you build without Ember, that's definitely going to happen or anything. It's just a tendency. And this is just one of the ways that Ember goes about trying to solve that problem for you. And the way I come to think about this is that Ember tries to flip this graph on its head, like this. So the boilerplate, the sort of the framework of the application itself is already so significantly complex that there's a massive learning curve. And I think everyone in this room will agree with me, there's a learning curve, right? You have to get to know a certain amount of things before you can really be productive with Ember. And the point is that you pay that cost up front. And once you've done it, once you've gotten over that learning curve, the world you reap the benefits afterwards. The world afterwards is where things just don't get any harder. So there is this point, I'm going to call it the sweet spot, when you've got your knowledge up to date, you've got your foundations of your application in place, and you're just adding new features, and it's easy. And for me, I believe that that point is somewhere just in the not too distant future for us. And there's a couple of reasons why that's happened, and I want to go through them. So just first, let me say, it has occurred to me that sweet spot might be a rainbow. That it might appear in the distance, and always, as you come closer to it, it just moves further away. Maybe that's how it's going to work out, and I'm totally open-minded to this happening, and if it does, I guess I should come back and tell you all about it. But I strongly believe it's not the case. I don't believe it's the case. I think there are things that we need to do to sort of facilitate ourselves over that learning curve. And that really is the thing that we've had to face over the last year or so as an organisation, was overcoming that learning curve. Not as an individual, I didn't manage that, but as an organisation. when we did that project of migrating to Ember, we didn't spend enough time like learning from the people who were helping us. We didn't internalize that Ember knowledge into the organization itself. So we had lots of contributors come and go and lead the project or the Ember side of the project for a little while, but at no point did we ever get anybody come in and do that full time. And the need to do that became painfully obvious. At a certain point earlier this year, we embarked on a project. We wanted to reskin the application. We wanted to make it look completely different. We wanted to change a few templates on how it's laid out, and we wanted to add a couple of new features to make it more powerful. And we sort of looked at this project and was like, well, it's a bunch of CSS. There's some changes to some templates that we need to do. It shouldn't be too hard. It should be okay. And we jumped in. And then we found out it wasn't okay. There was loads of work to do, and we just totally bitten off more than we could chew. And in hindsight, we didn't have anyone, like a technical leader on the Ember side of the application at the time, to actually assess how much work there was. We were guessing. So it's not really a surprise that we were wrong, is it? And so that's a challenge we were facing, and we knew what the solution was. We needed to hire someone. We needed to hire an engineer that was going to be full-time on the Ember application, and we've managed that. We hired our very own Ember wizard, Kevin, who's sat over there somewhere. And he has now taken on the Ember app and has been a catalyst and a positive force for change in the application. Has been, will continue to be, I'm sure. And it's the first really good positive thing that we've had happen since the actual migration itself that makes us feel like we're getting somewhere. Now that has been another challenge that we've faced, and that's been testing. So back when we first started this project, we were aware that the testing story in Ember wasn't as good as it was in Angular. People like to point that out to us a lot. But I wasn't too worried because we had this end-to-end testing suite, and it tested the admin, and I was confident it would still work once we switched to Ember. And it did work when we switched to Ember. It still worked, and it was in place. But what I hadn't anticipated was that testing suite would completely lose its value. The reason being that what that suite was designed to do was pick up on all the problems we were having with Backbone, those high-level problems. So it was checking things like, are things getting rendered at the right time in the right places? And, oh, by the way, is saving the post still working? Because that's kind of important and you keep breaking it. And so it was testing all these really high-level concepts. And once we'd switched to Ember, the problem areas, the things that were prone to bugs and regressions, turned out to be a completely different class of problems. It's all to do with states and tiny details within complex components that just get lost somehow. You know, it's intricate detail rather than big picture problems. And those sorts of problems lend themselves much more easily to being unit tested than end-to-end tested. And so we started looking around to do unit testing. And we weren't very happy because Ember Unit at the time only used QUnit, and we used Mocha in all of our server-side stuff. But Robert heard our plea. He made it happen. He made Ember Unit use Mocha for us and came and put the first unit test in Ghost. So I'm one of many people, I imagine, in this room that owes Robert beers, plural. And there's even a room in Slack for that, isn't there? So yeah. We've got unit testing in place, but again, remember, we didn't have anyone really leading that project, so there was no concerted effort towards adding test coverage. And then, more recently, we started running into real serious problems with that end-to-end testing suite. As you can see here, our Travis builds were just failing like crazy. And it had really gotten to the point where the value that they were providing versus how much time we were spending babysitting Travis builds and tracking down transient failures because of Flexbox or some timing error somewhere. It just got ridiculous. And look how long these builds take to pass. When you're waiting an hour to see if a pull request can be merged yet, it's just not cool. And I'm as the project owner, I'd really been clinging on to these tests for dear life because they gave me the confidence to ship. And so they were important to me. And a few weeks ago, I came to a realization that was a complete false sense of confidence. They weren't testing the right thing, so it wasn't really telling me the application was working. It was just crazy. And so I removed them from Travis. And now my feeling of discomfort at not having them actually reflects reality. We didn't have them anyway. And so now we're prioritizing putting Ember acceptance tests in, and we've got Kevin to help us work on that, and that's great. But the fundamental point underneath all of this is that we had this test suite that wasn't high quality. And if we have a test suite that is high quality, I think that might go a long way to pushing us into that sweet spot where we can really move fast and break a lot less things because we've got test coverage. So I've got one other quick little point that I wanted to make about productivity in Ember, and that is that Ember moves really, really fast. Now, when we first started using Ember, there was still some confusion, despite all of the opinionatedness of the framework, around certain areas like views and whether you should use controllers or components. And it's fantastic that the framework is evolving to resolve those problems for us. That's great. But it does leave behind legacy code that needs cleaning up, that we need to spend time on. And of course, you have to make changes and keep up and all this sort of stuff. And we've been really blessed because most of the time someone from the Ember community or one of our contributors sort of picks that up. They follow the Ember project, they make sure we're up to date, they future-proof the code. And they've gone a long way to making sure we're up to date, and we pretty much are. We're on 1.13.10, and the pull request to put us on 2.1 will merge at the beginning of the next release cycle. So we're up to date, that's good, that's all happened. And I'm spitballing here, but it does beg the question, what could we have achieved if we hadn't needed to do all that work? Just wondering. So anyway, wrapping up. As I was sort of writing that section of the talk, I really started to feel like, when you look back on things, it's really easy to be critical and negative and to think of things that you could do better or things that get in your way. It's really, really easy to be negative, and I didn't really like that vibe. I didn't want to end there. So I want to talk about what I think are the most positive aspects of this whole, don't really want to say journey, but I will. We've been on. The first thing is it really has been an absolute triumph of the open source community. You might pick up from what I said that you need an Ember expert to get started, that having your own wizard on board is a necessary part. But we did achieve building an Ember app without that. The community built it for us. That happened. And that's in no small part down to the fact that the Ember community really is an amazing bunch of people that really will get involved and help you to get off the ground with Ember. It's just, I can't praise the community enough. I love being part of it. Another thing I wanted to say is that there hasn't been any getting stuck. See, when we first started talking about Ember, another thing that kept being thrown at us, or we kept being told, is people had this fear that if you use Ember, this big monolithic framework, you're going to get stuck at a certain point where you want to implement a use case and Ember doesn't support it. And so you'll end up lost and stuck and too invested. And that was said a lot as a big reason to not use Ember, and I think it is still used. So we're over a year in, and that hasn't happened to us. Not even slightly. Not something that I think about or worry about. And I don't really think there's that many ways that can really happen to you. I think Ember's built in a way where you can always break out if you really have to. But I thought it was interesting to say, that really didn't happen for us. We've just been, building stuff. It's been great. And finally, Ember really is an incredibly powerful tool if you embrace it. And people have said about Ghost that it's an incredibly embery Ember app, and that we sort of do things the way that Ember expects. And that's great. And there's a really good reason for that. We do try really hard to do things the way that Ember intends and Ember expects. We try to work with the framework and not fight it. And there's a really good reason for that. And this harks back to what Yehuda said at the end of his talk about, building higher. When you build something with Ember, you are leveraging all of the knowledge, all of the learning, all of the experience, all of the smarts of the incredibly intelligent people who are behind the project. And those people spend all of their time thinking about how to do this, thinking about these hard problems. How do you build a framework that allows you to build applications that scale without scaling complexity? They're solving these problems for you. So if you build applications on top of open source software like Ember, you're standing on the shoulder of giants, and that's the true power of open source. So that's it from me. We've got one too. So if you are interested in Ghost and want to find out more, that's probably the best place to come and find us.